In the 1960s, the Zodiac killer terrorizes the San Francisco Bay Area.
You're just helpless, you're like an animal.
He launches a horrific killing spree.
The man pulled out a knife and just plunged it into Brian's back without any warning whatsoever.
And he threatens that children are next.
He said, "Children make nice targets. I think I'm gonna pick off a bus full of school children one day." I always kind of put this in terms of Zodiac being really one of the early terrorists.
This manhunt inspires a Hollywood film, and it immortalizes one man as the prime suspect. But were they right?
Many people are convinced that Arthur Lee Allen was, in fact, the Zodiac killer. However, the facts tell a very different story.
This is the real story of the police hunt for the most elusive killer in American history, and the error that allows the killer to slip their grasp.
Simple mistakes let the most notorious serial killer in American history escape justice.
In the 1960s, Benicia City is a sleepy town in Solano County, California.
David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were on their first date together.
Michael Butterfield is a world-renowned expert on these murders.
This was a pleasant night, and that was all shattered when another vehicle arrived and a man got out and opened fire on the car.
Suddenly, the unthinkable happens.
Kevin Fagan is a crime reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle.
No one ever really anticipates that some stranger's gonna come up and shoot you. You're just helpless, you're like an animal. You're like an animal getting gunned down. It's terrible.
Seven months after his first attack, the killer strikes a second time, just a few miles away. The Lover's Lane killer now seems to be in competition for headlines. He taunts police and gives himself a chilling moniker, the Zodiac. And it won't be long before the Zodiac strikes again. A month later, he targets a third couple, this time at the remote Lake Berryessa.
I've had 11 years patrolling this lake, and I've seen a lot of people cut up by boat accidents and this, but this is one of the worst things I ever witnessed.
The man pulled out a knife and just plunged it into Brian's back without any warning whatsoever. Cecilia Shepard had been stabbed 10 times, 5 times in the front and 5 times in the back. She was bleeding profusely, and she was in incredible, excruciating pain.
Getting stabbed to death is a slow, awful way to die. It's torture.
3 couples attacked in remote parts of the San Francisco Bay Area, and the killer seems intent on mayhem. But then he seems to go quiet. On October the 11th, San Francisco PD homicide detective David Toschi is called to a crime scene. In downtown San Francisco, in the hub of the theater district, a man had flagged down a taxi to take him to the residential area of Presidio Heights. When he arrived, he had no intention of paying the cab driver. To Toschi, the crime scene seems all too familiar.
It appeared to be a routine robbery of a cab driver, which unfortunately was not an unusual crime. Many cab drivers were robbed in that area. The first thing he discovered was that Paul Stein's lifeless body was laying slumped over in the front seat and in a pool of an enormous amount of blood, which appeared to have come from a wound in his head. The evidence indicated that the killer may have been a sloppy and uncoordinated person who was not familiar with committing these kinds of crimes.
At that time, Toski has no way of knowing how this crime will change his life. Just 2 days later, a letter arrives at the San Francisco Chronicle. The letter contains a piece of bloodied shirt from the dead cab driver. Duffy Jennings is working at the Chronicle when the letter arrives.
There's a lot of buzz around the paper. Did you hear about the letter they got this morning? Did you hear about the bloody piece of shirt?
The letter reveals that the killing was no ordinary city center homicide. It is signed, the Zodiac. It's the first time the killer has struck on Toski's turf. Suddenly, the detective and his partner, William Armstrong, find themselves at the forefront of the hunt for San Francisco's most wanted.
Toski and Armstrong were now immersed in the most important investigation in California and the search for the most notorious serial killer.
The manhunt inspires the Hollywood movie, which shows the struggle to catch the elusive killer. But the film also touches on a terrifying twist. For the Zodiac's letter contains a bombshell, a chilling warning that he was considering the unthinkable.
He also made a specific threat in that letter. He said, "Children make nice targets. I think I'm gonna pick off a bus full of school children one day."
Inspector Vince Rapetta was a rookie at the time of the murders.
But when you heard that, it was like, wow, this is really sick. You know, I wouldn't let my kid on a bus in those circumstances, in that situation, in that time and place. Yeah, find another way to get him to school.
Toski faces a crucial dilemma. If the Zodiac means what he says, then Toski should warn the public. But if the Zodiac's bluffing, the publicity will be playing into his hands.
The Zodiac seemed to crave attention, and police feared that publicizing his threats would only feed his ego and encourage him to do even more.
In the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle, journalists face the same dilemma.
This is where the big editorial decision now comes into play. Do we publish that part or not? I always kind of put this in terms of Zodiac being really one of the early terrorists, using the media to spread a paranoia and a fear in the community.
The police ask the Chronicle to hold off publishing the threat for a few days. In the meantime, they do what they can to keep kids safe.
So they assigned officers to ride along school buses, to drive alongside school buses. Police helicopters followed school buses, and bus drivers were given instructions on what to do if, in fact, someone did shoot at the bus.
But it's impossible to protect every school bus in the area. The Chronicle makes their decision. The risks are too great.
We did decide to publish the letter and the threat, mostly out of concern for public safety.
The revelation creates pandemonium.
Are you worried about it?
Well, yeah, certainly I'm worried about it.
Well, it's pretty bad. It makes a person afraid to go out.
I remember distinctly that there was a lot of fear in the community, and from a detective's point of view, there's going to be a lot of pressures come to bear that you wouldn't have in a normal homicide investigation.
And David Toski is at the heart of it.
We're on top of the case at the present time, but there are no new specific developments. We try to sift out the stronger leads. In a case of this magnitude, we stay on top of it as much as we can.
The pressure is now on Toski to catch the killer before he strikes again. But Inspector Toski's manhunt gets a critical breakthrough. Some children saw the killer of the cab driver and can give a description to the police.
Across the street, 3 kids were having a party in their home when they looked outside and saw a man inside the cab with Paul Stein. He appeared to be doing something to his body. They were terrified and called the police.
Toski's team worked with the children to gather a detailed description of the suspect and soon put together a composite sketch. It showed a white male with reddish or brown crew-cut hair, around 5'8" and wearing glasses. But Toski can't be sure the description is accurate.
Children are wonderful, but they're terrible witnesses. I mean, they don't know how to evaluate body size, characteristics, colors, dark, light, whatever. So you almost have to discount them. Most people are not trained investigators who retain details for descriptions of the killer. It would be so nice to have had a cell phone back then, One snap would have made a big difference.
But even if it's not perfect, their description is a very useful starting point. And there is also one other critical clue from the scene.
Police found several fingerprints, but one print in particular was found on the outside of the cab. This was the location where the killer was last seen by witnesses making contact with the cab. Blood was inside the grooves of the fingerprint.
This is fantastic news, but he now needs to draw up a list of all the suspects to check against the prints. So Toski looks into the earlier attacks, meeting with regional police investigators to establish everything they know about the killer.
Homicide's almost always committed by someone that the victim knows. It's going to be ex-boyfriend, mad that his girlfriend is now parked in a car in a lover's lane. Makes sense to me. That's the first place I'd look.
But despite exploring multiple avenues, they draw a blank. Toski wonders if he might gain more information from the second attack. This time one of the victims survived, Michael Mageau, and he caught a brief glimpse of the attacker before he was shot. Mageau didn't see his face, but his description broadly confirms the one given by the children at the taxi driver's murder. Toski inquires about the suspects the local police have investigated. Numerous men connected to Darlene Ferrin caught the police's eye, including her previous husband, ex-boyfriends, and other admirers.
There's a heavy vein of thought toward that. She was stalked. She was a spurned lover. Some guy was just fixated on her.
Investigators did identify several people who had known the victims and may have had a grudge. However, they quickly discovered that none of these individuals could be linked to the crime.
They conclude the killer was likely to be a stranger. So Toski looks at the pattern of the attacks.
Since the first 2 attacks occurred in the Vallejo area, he had to consider the possibility that the killer lived in or around Vallejo.
It's just a theory, but in fact Vallejo is roughly in the middle of all 4 crime scenes, supporting the idea. But Toski desperately needs more than just this to go on. So he digs into information on the 3rd murderous attack. Again, there was a surviving victim, Brian Hartnell.
I did think I was going to die. I don't think that he was acting under his total complete consciousness. But the real concern that I have is that he doesn't do this again.
Toski hopes Hartnell might be able to offer some leads as to the killer's identity. Hartnell described the attack. First, Cecilia spotted a man in the trees. Hartnell wasn't worried until he suddenly reappeared, brandishing a gun and dressed in a bizarre executioner's hood. Toski suspects that Mageau's survival from the previous attack had taught the Zodiac to be more cautious about witnesses. The hooded figure demanded their car keys and their money. He then insisted on tying them up. During all this, Brian attempted to engage the man in conversation. This means that unlike all other attacks, Brian is the only victim who has definitely spoken with the Zodiac.
Brian thought the killer's voice was very distinctive, and Brian later said that the killer spoke in a calm monotone, and that he may have had some kind of a drawl, but not a southern accent. Toschi was optimistic that Brian Hartnell might be able to identify the killer's voice.
The Zodiac could have little expected Hartnell to have survived to tell this story. Because as they thought the ordeal was coming to an end, the Zodiac turned on Hartnell and plunged a knife into his back. He stabbed him 6 times before turning on Cecilia and stabbing her 10 times, leaving them both to bleed to death. Luckily, someone on a passing boat sees the victims on the shoreline and calls for help.
Brian and Cecilia both underwent surgery, and Cecilia survived for 2 more days, but then she died from her wounds. Brian survived and was able to describe what happened and provide a description of the killer.
Brian Hartnell's knowledge could prove a vital piece of the jigsaw. But for now, Toschi still needs a lot more. The pool of possible suspects is far too vast. The city of Vallejo alone has almost 100,000 residents in 1969, and they don't even know that he does live there. Finding the killer may be an impossible task. Then, out of the blue, Inspector Toschi's manhunt gets a dramatic twist, as the Zodiac seems to suddenly break cover and calls live on air to the San Francisco talk show AM. He speaks to celebrity lawyer Melvin Belli, and with Jim Dunbar, who is the long-running host of the show.
Honestly, to be truthful, I thought there was some weirdo out there who was pretending to be Zodiac. I was curious, but there was a good deal of skeptical curiosity.
Just tell us what's going on inside your head right now, please.
I have headaches.
Right.
The caller doesn't talk for long before hanging up. Evidently cautious of the cops tracing the call, he calls back several times and keeps it short.
That was a rather convincing element to me. I thought, wait a minute, we got a real nutcase out there who is really concerned about these calls being traced. I was coming around to accepting that, hey, we got a killer on the phone.
Toschi gets news about the development and heads to the studio. Dunbar and Belli are trying to glean what they can from the caller, who gives little away.
I wanted to get him to explain or reveal a little bit about what was happening up here with him. It was during the run of the conversation that he mentioned something about a school bus.
If you could be assured that you won't be given capital punishment.
I don't want to give myself up.
What?
I want to kill those kids.
He really kind of went into another place on that. He really sort of talked with a delight about killing the kids. The tone kind of changed.
After several calls, the man hangs up for the final time. Toschi now has a recording of the voice of the man claiming to be the Zodiac. But Brian Hartnell has bad news.
Hartnell concluded that that was not the man he spoke to that day. This proved to be very disappointing for the investigators.
The alleged Zodiac has several more private calls with Melvin Belli. And this time the police do manage to trace the calls. It leads them to a psychiatric institution. Toschi confirms the caller was in care when the attacks were committed. Despite the publicity blizzard, the caller definitely isn't the Zodiac. The heat is on for Toschi to uncover the real Zodiac before he kills again. Toschi turns to clues the Zodiac himself sent in to local newspapers a few months before Toschi took over the case. Back in July 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle received its first ever letter from the Zodiac, along with a coded message. Duffy Jennings was there at the time.
There were 3 letters to 3 newspapers, the Vallejo Times and the Examiner and the Chronicle. Each had 1/3 of this 400-symbol cryptogram, in which the writer claimed that if somebody could solve the cryptogram, they would find out his identity.
The newspapers publish the cryptogram in the hope that someone can crack it. And one of their readers is Donald Harden, who, with his wife's help, begins to unpick the code. David Aranchak is an expert on the Zodiac ciphers.
One of the things they noticed about the first cipher was the appearance of patterns that were repeating. So what letters do that the most in the English language? And they deduced that it was L and L. So they started to think, okay, this is from a serial killer. Maybe the word kill is appearing in this message.
By plugging the word kill into the message, they start to decode the cipher.
And eventually, Donald's wife, Betty, thought maybe the message starts with I, because the killer was egotistical and would probably talk about himself, and he would talk about his crimes.
Within a few days, they decrypt a haunting message from the killer. It says he likes killing because it is so much fun. He claims to be collecting slaves for his afterlife. It suggests a dark insight into the killer's mind, though frustratingly, it doesn't reveal his identity. But there is one part of his code they cannot solve: the last 18 characters. This might be Toschi's lifeline. It might seem to be gibberish, but Toschi wonders if this end section is a code within a code. Could these characters reveal the Zodiac's identity? Might it simply be an anagram?
One of the techniques people used was to rearrange the last 18 letters to try to come up with a person's name.
This throws up several solutions, including Robert Emmett, the hippie. The police investigate all Robert Emmetts, hippie or otherwise, to see if one could be the killer. But it leads nowhere. A month after the cab driver's murder, the Zodiac writes with another code. Toschi is informed and rushes to take a look. The cryptogram is again published and sent to codebreakers in the FBI. But this code seems uncrackable.
My background's in computer programming, and I thought maybe I could try to solve it using a computer program. And so I spent years trying to do that, and to date still haven't succeeded.
He may have made it too hard, or he may just be wasting everyone's time.
Maybe he's brazen enough to put his identity into this code. Or maybe he's just, thumbing his nose at us and making us chase our tails. Because obviously he thinks he's smarter than everybody.
But even if they can't decrypt the cipher, it may be a clue in itself. The uncrackable codes may suggest he's a highly educated genius, trained in ciphers. A popular theory is the killer served in the armed forces. But is this all just a red herring for Toschi?
He didn't need to be a genius to come up with these codes. Anyone could have read one of these books and done the same thing with enough motivation. It's a very simple thing even a schoolboy could have done. It certainly was very popular in those days, the idea of making and breaking codes, stories about spies and criminals. It was a very popular idea at the time.
Toschi turns to psychological profiling of the killer in the hope of finding a useful lead. What kind of man are they looking for? One analyst predicts the Zodiac is a man who is probably impotent and afraid of women.
I imagine he didn't have many friends. I imagine he was probably a loner, resentful, held grudges, that type of person.
What Toschi knows for sure is the killer loves attention through his taunting letters to the papers. This egomania leads to an extremely bizarre plan to entrap him.
He would say things about, I'm waiting for a movie to come out about me. You know, there was one instance where there was a movie, an early movie about Zodiac, before the definitive one by David Fincher.
A B-movie about the killer is used to try to lure him to the theater. As the audience leave, they are asked to write down why they think the Zodiac killed.
Somebody actually was sitting inside the box, waiting for one of those entry slips to come through with handwriting that looked like Zodiac's.
The man waited, crouched, reading each slip. But the trick didn't work. Either the Zodiac was uninterested or not foolish enough to attend. Toschi is running out of options to catch the killer. But just as everything seems lost, he gets a major breakthrough in his hunt for the Zodiac killer. His colleague has received a tip-off that the killer lives with his mother in Vallejo, just a few miles from the Zodiac's first 2 crime scenes. This man, Arthur Lee Allen, is later made infamous in the Hollywood movie Zodiac, where he is portrayed as the prime suspect.
Arthur Lee Allen looks good because he lived in Vallejo, he lived near the place where Zodiac victim Darlene Ferrin worked, and he supposedly confessed to a friend his desire to commit Zodiac-like crimes and write letters to the local newspapers using the name Zodiac.
The informer, Don Cheney, claims that months before the Zodiac had become public knowledge, Arthur Lee Allen had discussed with him disturbing plans to go to lovers' lanes at night and shoot people, then send letters to the police and sign them Zodiac. After the Zodiac becomes a media sensation, Cheney says he made the connection and reports Allen to the police. The shocking parallels can't be a coincidence.
Toschi was impressed by the amount of evidence, but he has questions. Where was Arthur Lee Allen at the time of the murders? Does he have an alibi? And would any of the eyewitnesses identify him as the killer?
Toschi decides it's worth paying him a visit. Before they get far, he starts volunteering information that puts him further in the frame. He admits to something they didn't even know, that on the day of the Lake Berryessa stabbing, he was seen with a bloody knife. But he claims it was for killing chickens.
There's a feeling of peeling of the onion. Toschi and the crew that was looking into the Zodiac kept seeing more things look very promising. Allen is continuing to act odd. He acted guilty.
And when Toschi catches sight of Allen's wrist, he can't believe what he sees.
Arthur Lee Allen was wearing a Zodiac watch, which contained the name Zodiac and the crossed circle symbol used by the Zodiac in his letters.
It seems they have their man, but what they need is proof. Toschi suspects the Zodiac will have hidden macabre trophies of his victims. And when Toschi discovers that Allen has a remote trailer, he secures a warrant to search it.
They had high hopes that they would find something that could link him to the crimes, including the pieces of Paul Stein's shirt, or Paul Stein's driver's license, or the guns used in the Zodiac crimes, the costume worn at Lake Berryessa, and other items.
Frustratingly, they find nothing they can link to the attacks. But while there, they also take his fingerprints and get him to submit a writing test for them to compare his writing to the letters. If these match, they'll finally have their man. There's an agonizing wait for the result. Their handwriting analyst doesn't think that Alan's writing matches the Zodiac's.
The results of the handwriting comparison were disappointing. Toschi hoped that they might find evidence by matching Alan's fingerprints to the fingerprints found at the scene of the cab driver murder.
Toschi is told these prints don't match either. And there's another elephant in the room. The witnesses said the Zodiac has brownish hair, possibly weighs around 200 pounds, and is about 5'8". Whereas Alan is 6'1", and about 30 pounds heavier. And unlike the police sketch of the Zodiac, Alan is balding. Toschi is torn. The forensics don't support it, but his gut still says Alan is guilty. The chance to finally settle the matter comes 2 decades later, in the 1990s, with a scientific breakthrough. By now, Toschi has retired, and Inspector Vince Repetto has taken over the case.
At that time, forensic DNA testing was relatively new. We knew we had Arthur Lee Allen's DNA, and then we had DNA from one of the suspected letters.
Saliva from the back of the stamp is tested against Alan's DNA.
My partner was, very excited that we might be in some way take part in the solving of this crime.
And the results come in. Arthur Lee Allen's DNA doesn't match either.
Rick was very deflated. He was physically and demonstratively upset, man, I thought we had him. He was, he really thought that we were going to solve this case, and we didn't. He was pretty upset that it turned out not to be Arthur Lee Allen.
But if all this doesn't stack up, how can Don Chaney's testimony be explained? We reveal what the Zodiac movie doesn't, that suspicion now shifts from Allen to Chaney.
Don Chaney may have seemed like a compelling witness, but there were several problems with his story. Originally, he claimed that this conversation took place before the Zodiac murders began, but after discovering that some elements of his story did not match up on the timing, he changed the timing of the conversation.
It becomes increasingly doubtful whether Allen had said what Chaney claimed.
Chaney's credibility also suffered because after certain information was published in the media, he would then adapt his stories to include that information.
Chaney continued to make allegations against Arthur Lee Allen for decades. Michael Butterfield makes the claim of how incredible Chaney's alleged fabrications become.
When I interviewed Don Chaney, he told me that Arthur Lee Allen confessed his desire to fly airplanes into the Sears Tower, but the Sears Tower did not exist when this conversation supposedly took place.
But if he was making unfounded allegations against Allen, what possible motivation could Chaney have had?
Don Chaney complained that Allen had attempted to molest one of his children.
If Chaney thought Arthur Lee Allen had attempted to molest his child, that could have been a strong motivation for revenge. The books on which the Hollywood film Zodiac is based cite reams of circumstantial evidence against Allen and popularize the idea of him as the prime suspect, despite the lack of forensic evidence. Even after Allen's death in 1992, many still consider him the prime suspect.
Because of the book and the information in that book which appear to make Allen seem as if he must be the Zodiac, many people are convinced that Arthur Lee Allen was in fact the Zodiac killer. However, the facts tell a very different story.
But if it wasn't Allen, who was it? Back in 1971, Inspector Toski received a lead to another very promising suspect.
The postcard depicted a housing development project in Lake Tahoe. There was also some letters cut out of newspapers that had phrases like "sought victim 12" and "peek through the pines."
The postcard bears the Zodiac's crosshair symbol, and it suggests the Zodiac has other victims. Toski discovers that in the previous year, 25-year-old Donna Lass mysteriously disappeared from where the postcard suggested. This clue leads him to an incredible new suspect.
One man became a suspect because, according to some witnesses, he had known Donna Lass, the woman who disappeared in Lake Tahoe.
Could this man be the Zodiac? There are startling similarities. The suspect, Larry Kane, lived in Lake Tahoe, where Donna Lass disappeared. He previously lived in San Francisco when the Zodiac killed the cab driver. And there are disputed claims the suspect also knew Zodiac victim Darlene Ferrin. The coincidences keep growing.
This man had been in the Navy and apparently received some training in ciphers. He also had a criminal record of assault and battery and other instances of criminal behavior.
But Toski is unable to find enough solid evidence against him. His guilt is still unresolved when Toski moves off the case in 1978. Progress stalls until finally, a few decades later, when in 1997, Inspector Tom Bruton takes over the case.
There was just an enormous amount of circumstantial evidence. He always seemed to be in the vicinity of where a possible Zodiac crime occurred. He also changed his name several times for no apparent good reason.
Inspector Bruton and his partner visit the man for questioning and take samples of his handwriting and DNA. Could science finally unmask the Zodiac?
We had compared handwriting and fingerprints with what we had in the crime lab, and there was no matches there. The last big hope was a DNA comparison.
But the DNA results come back negative. Larry Kane is exonerated.
That was kind of the final straw as far as we were concerned.
This is just one of many instances where police or amateurs are convinced it's someone, but their theory is at odds with the forensic evidence.
I saw a lot of compelling circumstantial evidence against maybe a dozen suspects. And obviously, they all couldn't be the Zodiac. It's a good possibility none of them were.
The police faced a list of over 2,500 possible suspects. This is a problem Chronicle journalist Kevin Fagan is all too familiar with.
The sea of claims and leads is as large as the Atlantic. I mean, it's huge. I've had tons of people say, oh yeah, I had coffee in the table next to the Zodiac. He looked exactly like him. He was wearing the same glasses. I've been covering the Zodiac case for more than 20 years at the Chronicle, and I get hundreds of tips.
Many of the people who believe they have identified the Zodiac suffer from what's known as confirmation bias. They look for information which confirms their theory while usually studiously ignoring information which does not. And that is one of the reasons that we probably haven't identified the Zodiac, is because we continue to spend a lot of time on the wrong people.
In fact, we may never discover the killer's true identity.
If the Zodiac is still alive, he's probably laughing because he's been watching other people be accused of his crimes for years. And as long as authorities and amateur sleuths and others are looking at those suspects, they're not looking for him, and he's safe, and he knows it.
But the shocking truth is that Toski very nearly did capture the Zodiac, as one of his letters reveal. We rewind to the very day Inspector Toski found himself first thrust into the case. The Zodiac has just shot dead taxi driver Paul Stein. 3 children have seen him wiping down the cab before leaving the scene of the crime. The police are already on their way. Around this time, for some reason, there is a critical communication error.
During the confusion and the fear of that moment, it's possible that they may have said something like, "The man's wearing a black jacket," or "black pants." And somehow the dispatcher misheard this and then repeated they were looking for a black man instead of a white man.
Two officers, Don Falk and his partner, were approaching the scene in a patrol car.
They were driving west on Jackson Street when they saw a white man walking along the sidewalk.
There are disputed claims they even stopped and talked with the man, with no idea he might be the Zodiac.
Those cops apparently stopped him and asked him if he had seen a black man in the neighborhood anywhere. I believe he said that he did see a guy heading in a certain direction, opposite from the way he was going. And they said thanks and took off and drove away.
Because the man did not match the description, Officer Don Falk said that he just kept driving. Shortly after that, the police description was broadcast correctly as a white man, but by that time, the man had disappeared and Don Falk and his partner were unable to find him. This must have been quite a shock to Dave Toschi to learn that the Zodiac slipped through their fingers. A simple mistake let the most notorious serial killer in American history escape justice.
I'd love it if someday we found out who this guy was and had some idea of what motivated him and why he did it. I really don't think we'll ever know.
Over 1 year, the Zodiac murdered at least 5 innocent victims and terrorized the Bay Area. He achieved his desire for notoriety by taunting Toschi and the press with letters and codes. Even modern scientific advances have failed to bring the Zodiac to justice. February 1969. Hollywood heavyweight Tony Curtis is nominated for a Golden Globe for dramatizing one of America's most infamous serial killers, the Boston Strangler. In the film, George Kennedy plays Phil DiNatale, a city detective credited with catching the Strangler. But the real Phil DiNatale dies with his reputation in tatters amid claims he pinned one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century on the wrong man. Was Albert DeSalvo wrongly accused?
There were no witnesses to put him at the crime scene. There was no physical evidence to the crimes themselves. There was nothing.
This is the tragic story of a Boston hero who dies believing his legacy is in the gutter.
This is the untold story of the Boston Strangler by Philip J. DiNatale.
June 1962, and the sweltering streets of Boston's Back Bay neighborhood are bustling with people returning home from work. Above them, 55-year-old seamstress Anna Slessers is alone in her apartment. Anna puts on her favorite opera, Tristan and Isolde, while she gets ready for her son Murderous to take her to church. But the knock comes early. First officer at the scene is rookie detective Phil DiNatale. His first murder case is one he will never forget. Decades later, he recalls the moment.
It began on June 14th of 1962, Ann Slesser's murder. This murder was the turning point, the greatest turning point, and the greatest thrill of my life.
He finds Anna's room ransacked and her body laid out in a macabre, degrading pose. Around Anna's neck, the cord used to strangle her is tied in a flowing bow.
She was there, exposed, her legs splayed. This was something that he recalled, like this was done for a very specific purpose. What kind of scene is this to walk into?
Anna's son, Murderous, helps Di Natale piece the puzzle together. There's no sign of a break-in. Anna willingly let her killer into the apartment. Anna clearly had no idea that she had let in a demon. But the murder scene itself hinted that this was not merely a robbery gone wrong. Casey Sherman has written extensively about the murders.
The Anna Slessor's murder scene was completely bizarre for investigators to stumble upon. It looked like a ransacked apartment. It looked like a robbery, but nothing was taken from the apartment.
There were other clues buried in the chaos. Phil Di Natale's son John is a renowned private investigator in Boston.
There wasn't a lot to go on, but he quickly thought the killer had to be left-handed. And that was because of the way things were thrown out of dressers that had been opened up, the way a coffee cup had been left on the table, some of the bruising on some of the victims, indicative of somebody coming with a left hand from behind.
But the left-handed monster left no prints, no murder weapon, and appeared to have no motive. For a rookie murder detective, it's a confusing scene. And it is just the beginning.
The murder was the tip of an iceberg that would create one of the biggest murder cases, not only in American history, but in the history of the world.
It isn't long before Di Natale discovers just how big the iceberg really is. 2 more murders follow in quick succession. Both follow the same macabre pattern. 68-year-old Nina Nichols is strangled at her apartment in Commonwealth Avenue. A giant bow wrapped around her neck and her body, violated by a wine bottle. Hours later in Lynn, Massachusetts, 65-year-old Helen Blake is found face down on her bed. A stocking and bra entwined around her neck in the same elaborate bow.
One crime scene to the next were almost identical, and no physical evidence, no sign of forced entry, no eyewitnesses. Nobody saw anybody leave the scene.
These weren't just murders, they were macabre decorations. They were fantasies being lived out by the killer himself, positioning these defenseless victims in awkward ways, subjecting them to torture and humility and cruelty in a way that no other detective had seen that before.
Soon there are more. To the first 3 murders, Di Natale connects Ida Erger and Jane Sullivan, all following an identical pattern. Elderly white women living alone. But by winter, it becomes clear that no one will be safe. With 16 shopping days to Christmas, hospital nurse Sophie Clark is writing a letter to her fiancé.
My dearest Chuck, may this letter find the man I love well. How is that cold of yours? I feel fine, especially after you called me last night. You're the kind of medicine I need. You make me feel well without putting in any effort. Darling, I hope you don't take this long to write again. You know how I get when I don't hear from you.
The letter is never finished.
Sophie Clark was a murder that was real warm. She went to work that morning on December the 5th of 1962, and she come back. And about an hour or 2 later, she was found dead.
6 murders in 6 months.
We gotta get this guy.
No longer feeling protected by the police, women begin taking extreme measures to defend themselves.
Boston was a very trusting place in the early 1960s. That all changed when women began to die at a very alarming rate. No one felt safe Women used to sleep with ski poles under their mattresses. They would put up glass bottles against their doors so that if the strangler got in, at least they would have an alarm that would trigger them to get out of there as fast as they could. Dog pounds were literally being cleared out of stray dogs. Women that had never owned a pet before were now purchasing German Shepherds. They were walking around with switchblade knives and hairpins that they could use to fend off an attacker. Women began to mobilize themselves and to arm themselves really for the first time in American history.
It is clear to the women of Boston that no one is safe. A sex predator is on the loose. And as fear turns to anger, the Boston police take the brunt. Susan Kelly is the author of The Boston Stranglers.
The press generated a lot of hysteria, and it was like throwing a glass of acid. It splashes everywhere and hits everything. The police were being called incompetent bums all the time.
Why have you need to touch him? You're useless. Get a move on. It's serious. Why haven't you got anybody? Come on, seriously. What are you doing?
You must work hard.
It's getting serious. Useless. Your job is to protect us. You need to touch him. Don't feel safe. Touch him.
For Phil in particular, the public's anger is an especially bitter pill to swallow. He is from a family with a proud history in the Boston Police Department. A family who have protected the city for generations. In 1950, Phil's father, Salvatore, solved America's biggest heist at the time, the Great Brinks Robbery.
Right then and there, I made up my mind I was going to become a police officer like my father and the rest of my brothers.
After returning from World War II, Phil and his brothers become police officers. But the family had to fight hard to break through in a police force dominated by Irish Americans.
There was always this kind of underlying little, well, there's the Italian.
Miles Jewell is Phil's grandson.
It was a very Irish police force. Here you have this, Italian fellow trying to, work his way up the ranks. And so there's a little bit of animosity.
When Phil was offered a breakthrough assignment as a detective, he smelt a rat.
The Boston Public Gardens, one of the oldest public gardens in the country. But at night, they can turn into, difficult places to be. And back then, they were being harassed by what they call them purse snatchers.
He was being sent undercover to catch muggers. But it wasn't the role he was expecting.
That guy just went up in the air and down on the ground and screamed at him, "You're no lady." And he says, "That's right, you're under arrest."
On his first night, Phil and his partner Jimmy make an arrest. It is clear that the young Italian cop will do whatever it takes. It's a lesson soon learned by a local gang terrorizing the neighborhood. The hoods see nothing to fear in two Boston cops without backup.
They had screwdrivers and chains and brass knuckles.
Guy's under arrest.
So what you gonna do? There's a moment at which Phil says to Mellon, you better call an ambulance. And they say, yeah, the ambulance is for you. And he say, no, it's for you guys.
They arrested all five, and neither one of them ever pulled their gun.
No matter who you were or how much you hated Phil, he was going to earn your respect.
Punks! They were both awarded the Thomas Sullivan Medal of Honor, which is the highest award in the Boston Police Department.
Seriously!
Di Natale's battle for recognition is finally rewarded with a Strangler investigation. Immediately, his hard-earned reputation is under the spotlight.
Everybody was willing, and everybody donated many, many, many precious hours of their own time to work on this case. It was just unbelievable where we couldn't come up with any kind of a clue. It's just like the man would be the shadow.
And the shadow is about to commit his most shocking crime yet. January 1964. The Boston Strangler has eluded the lead detective for 17 months. In that time, he has killed 11 women. The latest is Mary Sullivan, killed just days before her 20th birthday. For Casey Sherman, the murder is profoundly personal.
My Aunt Mary Sullivan was a beautiful young woman. She was funny. She was bright. She was a friend to everyone that had known her. Mary's murder created a hole, not just in my family, but in an entire community. Anybody that met her for the first time was immediately drawn to her because of her wit, because of her charm, and because of her beauty. She had been strangled with 3 ligatures, 2 scarves and a nylon stocking, all wrapped very tightly around her neck. She had also been sexually assaulted with a broomstick.
While the identity of the strangler remains a mystery, every man becomes a suspect.
People in Boston became very paranoid about friends, neighbors, acquaintances. Anybody who was a little bit off or just slightly eccentric in some way. There was one incident of a woman who had an ex-boyfriend or a man friend of some sort, whom she was convinced was the strangler because he used a pogo stick.
Over 400 suspects are questioned. All will be released.
They were at a loss on how to figure out how to solve this. I mean, they just had no ideas. I mean, like literally none. What in the world was going on here? I mean, it's completely twisted.
The murders take a toll on the proud detective.
One crime scene to the next were almost identical in as much as no physical evidence, no sign of forced entry, no eyewitnesses, nobody heard anything, nobody saw anybody leave the scene. Those were all kind of things that kept my father up at night.
Phil DiNatale could never escape the killings.
He would become quite sullen, quite depressed, but also you could see kind of like a grit that he and everybody else had. But it was that grit that was like, okay, we'll get to the bottom of this.
We were desperate for clues, and we listened. I'll listen to the garbage man if he has something to tell me. And I'll even be nice to the devil if he can give me the information that I'm looking for and bringing about the solution of this strangling.
This wasn't, my shift's over at 4 o'clock, I'm going home. It was his life. I mean, it really took precedent over almost anything in his life. I don't know that at that period of time that he came to maybe one of my baseball games. He just had this all-encompassing tunnel vision that wouldn't let him away from this.
With the pressure mounting, DiNatale's health is in jeopardy.
That was a period of time that I think affected him not so much emotionally, but physically. As each murder occurred, it was almost as if, somebody was turning up the volume on a pressure cooker. suffered a heart attack midway through this investigation, and clearly the result of stress.
Sir?
Where am I?
You are at Longwood Hospital.
The heart attack forces Di Natale to take a break. But even in the hospital, he can't let go.
Here he is, sick as a dog, suffering potentially heart failure, and he's still investigating.
And there was something about Longwood Hospital that rang a distant bell.
Did you say earlier Longwood Hospital?
Yes, sir. You are in Longwood Hospital.
Everything somehow, some way was gonna connect him back to what he was trying to do.
Di Natale was sure that one of the Strangler victims worked at Longwood. Sophie Clark.
Sophie Clark ring a bell? She was a student nurse here at this hospital, wasn't she?
Why are you talking about
The question sparks an unexpected response.
You need to rest.
Excuse me, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am.
Di Natale soon discovers that something was spooking the staff at Longwood.
Oh, great.
How are you feeling?
Yeah, not too bad. So, did you know Sophie Clark?
Later that afternoon, another technician came up and I started talking to her about Sophie Clark. Well, I'm telling you, she dropped everything in the pan she had been carrying and ran out of the room.
The nurses know more than they are letting on. In the middle of the night, the detective gets a call.
Detective Di Natale.
A man is calling on behalf of a terrified nurse. He claims that she was raped and gives Phil the name of the man she claims did it.
DeSalvo. DeSalvo?
The investigation is in its second year, and hundreds of names have passed across Phil's desk. But DeSalvo wasn't one of them. It is clear that the nurses who knew Sophie Clark live in terror. Could the cause of that terror be Albert DeSalvo? Di Natale needs to know about him, and fast. After almost 2 years, lead detective Phil Di Natale finally has a lead in his hunt for the Boston Strangler. He checks himself out of the hospital and travels to the house of the new suspect, Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo's record shows he is a handyman living in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood with his wife and 2 kids. But currently, he is detained in Bridgewater State Mental Hospital for reasons yet unknown.
He starts to think, okay, I'm gonna start checking this guy out. Has there ever been a parking ticket? What other criminal records does this person have?
DeSalvo's criminal history is the stuff of nightmares. His rap sheet lists multiple minor juvenile offenses, breaking and entering. But most shocking is that he became known as the Measuring Man, gaining access to the homes of single women and violating them. Phil is particularly intrigued by how the Measuring Man gained access to the woman's apartments.
He would go around to women's doors, knock, and say the Powers Agency was given your name as a possible model. And they've asked me to come and get some measurements. And he would get them to put on a leotard or nothing and measure them in all the classic places, around the chest, around the waist, the thighs, and he would, unbeknownst to them, often have an orgasm while that was going on.
DeSalvo had a long history of sex crimes against women, yet somehow his name had never cropped up in relation to the Boston Strangler.
Now, Albert DeSalvo was not on a list of suspects that was 3,000 names long. No one had ever even known he existed.
It isn't long before DeSalvo's perverted con takes a violent twist. October 27th, 1964. A woman from Cambridge describes her attacker.
I need to report a rape. He was wearing green work outfit.
Somehow, DeSalvo had never appeared on the suspect list. Phil needs to know why. Phil's chief has bad news.
They said, Phil, he's not your guy. He'd been in jail in the House of Correction for 2 years, and therefore he was in jail for maybe the first 6 or 7 murders. He couldn't have been the Strangler.
Most cops would have left things there, but something in Phil believes DeSalvo is too perfect a suspect. Surely there had been a mistake.
So he wasn't going to take anyone's word for the fact that Albert was in jail, because he liked him. He liked him as a suspect, and now this was all going down the tubes because somebody told him that he's not your guy because he was in jail. So he went to the source.
Phil travels to the city courts to check DeSalvo's files for himself.
You didn't punch somebody's name and date of birth into a computer and up pop their criminal history. Off he goes to the court in Cambridge, and he goes in and explains, I want to look at this guy's record.
But when he finds it, it's not what he wants to read. It appears his team was right. Or were they? As he gathers up the records, he notices a faint stamp that everyone else has missed. DeSalvo was released early on good behavior, days before Anna Slessers was murdered. The Boston Strangler's first victim. Phil heads straight to Bridgewater to interview Albert DeSalvo, who is incarcerated for sex crimes. But Phil can't get close. DeSalvo has hired a lawyer, renowned attorney F. Lee Bailey.
I was representing a fellow charged with murder. Albert DeSalvo was in the next room to him and asked if he could arrange for me to meet. And this fellow said, you know, I think DeSalvo was something big, I don't know what. Albert DeSalvo's early life explains a great deal of how he became a mindless assassin. His father was a brute. He used to beat up the mother or bring prostitutes home and have games with them in the wife's bed. He taught his son to be a thief at age 6, taught him to have sex with his sister when he was 7.
But the man he meets is nothing like the monster he had come to expect.
Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Bailey.
I thought that he was a very ordinary-looking serviceman who used to go around and do fixes on stoves and dishwashers and things like that.
But when DeSalvo started talking, Bailey realized why single women might be happy to let him into their homes.
He's the kind of fellow you wouldn't hesitate to invite into your home to have dinner with the family. He was about the last thing in the world you'd expect to fill in the ghostly picture of what the Boston Strangler would look like.
The interrogation is taken over by the district attorney's office. The floodgates open, and DeSalvo starts to tell his story. He confesses to 13 Strangler murders, claiming 2 more than Phil DiNatale even knew about. What's more, he has an encyclopedic knowledge of every crime scene. At last, Phil learns how the killer got into the victims' apartments.
He would knock on the door and say, your landlord has sent me. It appears that your lease requires that you get a new refrigerator. And women who heard something like that, knowing full well they had no right to a refrigerator, opened the door, and once he got inside, needless to say, he never looked at any refrigerators, but he always talked his way in.
DeSalvo reveals details never reported in the newspapers. Details surely only the murderer would know. He knew that Anna Slessers was listening to Tristan and Isolde, and that before he left, he had turned the sound on the record player down.
Sophie Clark, was strangled to death. DeSalvo was asked what was under the stuffed chair near her body. He said, "A tampon. I pulled it out of her." What was behind the bureau out of sight? He said, "A box pack of Marlboro cigarettes. I knocked them off by mistake and didn't pick them up." No pictures that the public ever saw had that information, but the police file did.
After thousands of leads and hundreds of interviews, Phil DiNatale's painstaking attention to details others overlooked has paid dividends. The Boston Strangler is behind bars. But the case will come back to haunt him in ways he could never imagine. November 1973, 8 years after DiNatale caught the Boston Strangler Albert DeSalvo, one of the 20th century's most feared serial killers is murdered in his cell.
Someone with a shiv, a knife made in the prison wall somehow, stabbed him in the heart and killed him.
Prison justice carried out by an inmate on a notorious sex criminal was not unusual. But the night before he was murdered, DeSalvo did something that made headlines around the world. DeSalvo reaches out to the prison psychiatrist.
He called Ames Roby, the forensic psychiatrist, and said, "Can you come to the prison tomorrow? I need to talk to you." Dr. Roby told me that DeSalvo sounded extremely agitated, and he asked, "Okay, what do you want to talk to me about?" And DeSalvo said, "I want to tell you the truth." And Dr. Roby said, "Okay, I'll be down there tomorrow morning."
Now, Albert DeSalvo was a very curious criminal. He was a sexual con man, he was a rapist, and he was a thief. The question is, was he homicidal? Was he a killer?
Albert DeSalvo was then under arrest for a number of crimes that did not involve murder, where the witnesses were going to identify them. He knew he was gone, but he didn't want to go to the electric chair in the process, and that was the conundrum he handed me to solve.
Journalist Susan Kelly discovered that despite his confessions, many in the police force never believed DeSalvo was the Strangler.
As I talked to more and more people, the conversation would come around inevitably. Who do you think the Boston Strangler was? Apparently, this is like one of the largest non-secret open secrets in Boston area law enforcement, because no one I talked to, no one thought DeSalvo was the Strangler.
Kelly had an unconventional idea. Might DeSalvo have been killed to hide the identity of the real Boston Strangler? Overnight, DiNatale's proudest professional achievement was suddenly thrown into doubt. Out of nowhere, small details in his confession were questioned. Like the fate of the knife DeSalvo claimed he used to kill Beverly Siemens at her home in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
He said that he had brought the knife with him and that he stabbed her. He got the number of times he stabbed her radically wrong, and then took the knife and threw it into a swamp in one of the western suburbs. Well, the knife was there on the drain board of the kitchen in the apartment.
With DeSalvo's confession showing intriguing inconsistencies, alternative theories began to arise. Critics pointed to the fact that, already facing a life sentence as a serial rapist, DeSalvo was never actually tried or convicted for the Strangler crimes. Furthermore, no physical evidence ever linked DeSalvo with any of the murder scenes. Confessions aside, there were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, nothing at that time. DeSalvo's confession is picked apart. Susan Kelly argues that DeSalvo's questioning broke basic police protocol.
He asked very leading questions. He would say something like, "Tell me how you killed so-and-so," or "Did you do this when you killed so-and-so?" And he kind of fed DeSalvo a lot of his material. What struck me was how inaccurate it was.
So why would an innocent man incriminate himself?
I said, He'll help you. He'll show that he did these murders, and the price you must pay is you can't kill him. That's all you have to do.
DeSalvo could make some money on the sale of his life story to various magazines and to the movies.
I started to create a profile of Albert DeSalvo being somebody that was a con man, somebody that was a sexual predator, but somebody that was willing to say anything and do anything to get what he wanted. And what Albert DeSalvo wanted was money.
A person can do a lot for $10,000.
If DeSalvo wasn't the Strangler, who was? One man neatly ties up all the loose threads. Albert DeSalvo shared a cell with known murderer George Nassar.
All right, Strangler.
George Nassar was the tip of the spear for the Boston mob during the early 1960s. He was violent, but he was brilliant. And he was DeSalvo's cellmate at Bridgewater State Hospital. Now, George Nassar lived in the South End of Boston, in the heart of the Boston Strangler kill zone. When police raided his apartment, they found uniforms, doctors' uniforms, police uniforms, uniforms that would have given him access to buildings in the city, uniforms that would have given him the trust of women.
Could Nassar have fed DeSalvo information about his crimes? The details that so impressed the cops. While the idea gained ground, Phil DiNatale was helpless to protect his reputation.
So Phil felt that folks that were coming up with these alternative theories were essentially, it was a lack of respect for the work that all these detectives had done.
And that's what gives me a cancer, and I've had it ever since.
Eventually, his failing health catches up with him. On the 25th of January, 1987, Phil DiNatale dies of heart failure.
I don't think that when he died, based on his close participation in all phases of the case, there was a shred of a doubt in Phil's mind. But Albert was the Strangler. Indeed, Phil is probably the first detective to be convinced of that.
DiNatale died knowing that his most famous case was now in doubt. It will take over 2 decades before decisive evidence proves who is the Boston Strangler. It's 2012. 50 years since the Strangler killed his final victim, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, violating her body with a broomstick. Police forensic scientist Donald Hayes is clearing up old cases when he comes across a photo of the crime scene.
I observed a blanket in the crime scene photos that was in between the legs of Mary Sullivan as she was lying on the bed at the homicide crime scene. It was apparent to me, looking close up and magnifying in the areas of the blanket, that there appeared to be staining on the blanket, which was one of the items I was very interested in looking at.
At the time, the police bemoaned the absence of any physical evidence of the crime scenes. The advent of DNA profiling changed the rules entirely. Suddenly, a single hair or a drop of blood was enough to link an individual to a crime scene. Remarkably, 38 years after the murder, Hayes finds a blanket in the evidence box.
We have the blanket, we have our clothes, we have the broom handle, we have swabs, we have an appropriate, useful, probative level of evidence on Mary Sullivan that was still in Boston police custody.
At the time, Hayes was most concerned with testing the long-running rumors.
So there was a theory out there that George Nassar was responsible for the Boston Strangler murders.
In 1998, prisoners had their DNA stored in a national database.
Because George Nassar was a convicted felon, he would be in that database. So we searched that profile and we got no hits or links to anyone in that database.
The results were conclusive.
George Nassar was excluded at that point as a source of the DNA we found in the murder of Mary Sullivan.
With NASA ruled out as the Strangler, attention turned to the affable Boston handyman. Could Albert DeSalvo be linked directly to the murder scene? But Dugan and Hayes had a problem. DeSalvo had been killed before criminals had been required to provide DNA for the database. Their only hope was to find a close relative.
In our attempts to locate a known male family member of Albert DeSalvo from which to collect a DNA sample from which we could develop a Y chromosome and try to match it to the evidentiary sample. In doing the research, we found that the brother, he had sons, that would be nephews of Albert DeSalvo, right down the same male lineage of the family.
Plainclothes investigators tracked down Albert DeSalvo's nephew.
They were working down on Cape Cod, so we had our investigators follow them.
When the moment comes, they swoop in. But they are not interested in stopping DeSalvo's nephew. They want his DNA.
Our investigators collected those water bottles, and we got a DNA sample.
The results are tantalizing enough for investigators to request that DeSalvo's body be exhumed for an in-depth evaluation. Armed with the new evidence, Hayes convinces a judge to allow him to exhume DeSalvo's body for testing. DNA is extracted from his left femur. Could they get a perfect match from DeSalvo's DNA?
I was on the golf course, and I turned on my cell phone, and then, I got bing, 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 and I'm thinking, well, what the hell's going on? I got like 13 text messages, and another 25 emails, and then the phone's ringing, and it's my wife. She said, have you heard? They did DNA testing. They just had a press conference, and Albert was found to have killed Mary Sullivan. And I was like, I was overjoyed. I truly was overjoyed.
The science shows that Albert DeSalvo's DNA matches the semen samples found at Mary Sullivan's crime scene, with a 1 in 220 billion chance of error.
There is no dispute. Albert DeSalvo raped and murdered Mary Sullivan on January the 4th, 1964.
I've lived with Mary's memory every day, my whole life. And I didn't know, nor did my mother know, that other people were living with her memory as well. And it's amazing to me today to understand that people really did care about what happened to my aunt.
The evidence that we were able to bring to light completely vindicate Phil DiNatale. He was absolutely correct, 100%. He was wrong about nothing. He was right. He just didn't have the science that we have today.
For 27 years, Phil's family lived with the knowledge that he died with his reputation dragged through the mud. At last, they could be released from their nightmare. Phil's theories were finally proved correct.
At the time of his death, Phil DiNatale, great detective, great investigator.
I thought about Phil, and I thought, this would have been his day.
I'm sure he didn't have the closure of knowing that justice had been done to Albert DeSalvo.
For 20 years, he went around with people taking pot shots at him.
He knew Albert was guilty. He was right.
I said, I'm going to go to my dad's grave, because I'm sure the dirt's all turned over, because he's just turned over in his grave, because he's going to be so happy about this.
Mary Sullivan's murderer was Albert DeSalvo. given the similarities between this murder and the others, the question of the Boston Strangler has finally been put to rest. There is no doubt that the Di Natale family have another police hero in their ranks.
My father always wanted to be a police officer. I think he probably cherished his badge right after his family. He loved his badge. He loved being a cop. He was right. You know, at the end of the day, he was right. He would have been satisfied that justice had been done.